Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, a place where industry experts discuss how technology is impacting our life, our work, while also transforming entire industries and even the world. Every day, I'm going to be serving you a daily dose of optimism and motivation while highlighting along the way that technology really does work best when it brings people together. And on today's episode, I want to explore what biodiversity is and the role of technology and what it can play in improving biodiversity. For example, did you know that a loss of biodiversity represents a risk of more than half the world's GDP, which equates to around $44 trillion? And by that, I mean things like pollination, decomposition, carbon storage, water purification, etc. So essentially, it feels like we need to develop the links between payment to manage landscapes and impact that will slow or stop biodiversity loss. But of course, the problem we run into here is investors need metrics. And maybe technology could provide the solution to measuring what we're asking businesses to pay for. So what does this look like? And where does technology fit in all this? Well, today I've invited Dr. Mike Musgrave to join me in the conversation about all this and also learn more about how the School of Wildlife Conservation at the African Leadership University is working with the Dalberg Catalyst and Financial Services Deepening Africa to develop a Biodiversity Investment Ratings Agency. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm hoping we can all learn something together. So buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening in the world, I'm going to be beaming your ears all the way to France, where you're going to join me in conversation with Mike about all this and also talk about COP15 and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Good morning, Neil. Thanks very much. My name's Dr. Mike Musgrave, and I work at the Africa Leadership University in the School of Wildlife Conservation, a relatively new university based out of Kigali in Rwanda.
And there's so much I'm looking forward to talking to you about today, but I'd love to take you back in time for a moment. I mean, can you remember where your passion for technology came from, or a moment that put you on the path you're on today, and how the worlds of technology and biodiversity would collide for you?
Yeah, I guess it comes from my father, I guess. You know, he was an engineer on some of the early mainframe computers when I was growing up, and had always had an interest in tech. And, you know, I grew up in South Africa, and South Africa only got television in 1976. So I guess I might have been 8 or 9 years old when we got our first television. And so my dad was always kind of at the forefront of any new tech that would come out. And I remember getting the first Pong game and playing it on the television. And I remember the first laser printer arrived in his office, and it was demonstrated with huge fascination. And so I kind of naturally progressed into it. And I remember having an Apple Newton PDA as when those first came out in the early 80s. So the interest in tech has been around for a long time.
Yeah, I think we must be of a similar age. I too started out life with that Pong machine before progressing to the Atari 2600, Commodore 64, all those great days. But I invited you on the podcast today to try and demystify biodiversity. So just to set the scene for our conversation, because a lot of people have a few preconceptions, maybe misconceptions around exactly what biodiversity is. So one of the reasons I ask you this is because I think many people listening will think they know what it means, but might have completely the wrong idea. So the question for you is, what is biodiversity?
Yeah, it's a good question, Neil. And I think the easiest way to summarize it is to say it's the sum of all the species that live on Earth or in a particular environment. So if you walked out into your back garden, what is biodiversity? It's all the plants and all the insects and the frogs and the slugs and the snails and the rats and the fungi that grow in your wood pile, and everything that works together to make a system work, to make our ecosystems work. And we usually think of it, in a grand scale, like in a tropical rainforest, but biodiversity is everywhere. We live surrounded by it. It's the sum of all the species that we see, and many of which we don't see.
And one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today is because I always love busting myths and misconceptions about different industries and things that are happening right now. And when we talk about biodiversity, I read a great quote from you guys, and that was biodiversity loss actually represents a risk to more than half the world's GDP, around 44 trillion, which just completely blew my mind. But can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So if we think of where our food comes from, we think of, supply chains, we think of everything that's an input into our economy, whether it's clean water, fertile soils, these are all maintained by biodiversity. For example, we've heard recently about pollution problems off the coast of the United Kingdom, pumping sewage into the sea. Well, the fact is that you can actually pump sewage into the sea quite easily, because the biodiversity, all the bacteria and little creatures that live out there, will eat that up and clean it all up for you. Now, when that starts decreasing and disappearing, this is when you start running into problems. So if we had to, for example, clean up all of that water that you pump out into the oceans using machinery or using technology, this would represent a cost to us. And we're seeing across the world, whether it's pollination services. Can you imagine if we had to replace bees with human beings and little paintbrushes going to pollinate orchards of orange trees? These services that biodiversity provides to the economy have a value. And as that value, or as the biodiversity decreases and disappears, we're losing the value that it provides to us and to our economy.
And one of the reasons I wanted to dive a little bit deeper in this, because it is a huge problem that will impact every single person listening to this podcast in 165 different countries. And of course, we need to attract investment into that area, and investors need metrics. And that stat of 44 trillion will be enough to get the attention of most people listening. And I'm curious, can you tell me more about how investors need those metrics, and also how tech will provide the solution to measuring exactly what you're asking businesses to pay for here? Because that's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And the problem comes from many of these systems being very complex and very complicated. If we look at a very simple service like pollination, we can pretty easily measure the financial implications of pollination. We can say, okay, well, let's provide some more habitat for bees. But when we look at soil fertility, when we look at the oceans processing our sewage and our waste, when we look at complex ecosystems, we need to be very specific about what we're measuring and what we're providing to investors in terms of metrics and measurements. And that's been very difficult. But with advances in technology now, it's becoming, it's at least within sight now that we can measure things in a much more complex way and then provide those metrics. So investors, when they put their money down and say, we're investing in this ecosystem or in managing this particular environment, and we're getting proof that our money is making an impact. And that's what they need in order to be able to invest.
And of course, this is a daily tech podcast, and I'm fascinated by how technology is transforming just about every element of our world. So if we do take a look under the hood at some of the technical elements making this possible, I was reading that cheap monitoring networks, big data, AI, and increasing sophistication and lowering cost of satellite imagery, LiDAR, and maybe even spaceborne LiDAR. This space is just so exciting right now. So can you expand on some of this? Because I would imagine for many people listening, they're completely unaware of what's going on here.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is a convergence of all of these things. And so, for example, if we need to monitor the location of animals, we now put a collar on those animals and have a tower with a cheap receiver on there, monitored via the LoRaWAN networks. Monitoring soil moisture, monitoring temperature, monitoring all of these parameters in the environment has now become so cheap that it's generating data is not a problem anymore in terms of the volume of data. It's a problem because it's so easy to generate so much data. And so what's happened as a result of that is the big data and AI processing that is, again, if it's not quite there yet, it will be in 5 years' time. It's able to digest all of this data and extract information and deliver much better predictions from these vast data sources that we can implement at relatively low cost. Camera trapping, if we want to monitor where species are located and how they're moving around a landscape. We stick up a whole lot of camera traps, and we can generate millions of images in a matter of a few months. And so if we combine that then with satellite imagery, which has been used for a long time to study ecosystems and how deforestation takes place, for example. We've used satellites for a long time, but never before have we had so much free imagery available at such fine resolution. And that's just increasing and going to increase over the next few years. LiDAR is a complete game changer when it comes to assessing carbon, for example. If we are able to scan a forest and get an accurate 3D representation in real time of a forest using LiDAR, we can measure very precisely the amount of carbon that forest stores year on year. I struggle to even imagine spaceborne LiDAR and how that transforms things. Imagine having a 3D image of every single tree on the whole planet using a spaceborne LiDAR. I mean, it's a way to go before we get there, but it's technically certainly very possible. And I see that happening, certainly within my lifetime, well within my lifetime. And so there's a real revolution in terms of the convergence of all these different technologies together with the networking that ties them together, that for the first time is going to enable us to get a real detailed picture of ecosystem functions and the parameters that, again, going back to the early point, that we would like to report to investors and say, this is what we're spending your money on. This is where you're getting the value.
It really is such an exciting space at the moment. And some people listening will say there is a lot of talk at the moment, maybe too much talk and less action. So to bring this topic to life today, can you tell me a little bit more about maybe a real world example? And one that springs to mind is how the School of Wildlife Conservation at the African Leadership University and how it's working with, I think it's Dalberg, Catalyst and Financial Services, Deepening Africa, to actually develop a Biodiversity Investment Ratings Agency. It's incredibly exciting what's happening here, and I'd love to share the work that you're doing and how you're doing that. But can you expand on it? Yeah, sure. So we're taking action here. One of the things about measuring stuff and reporting metrics is that those things need to be verified. Okay, there's a lot of people, whenever there's money and investment around, there's a lot of people trying to move in and make a quick buck by reporting stuff that isn't really happening or not being thorough about it. We've seen some of this in the carbon markets where carbon capture and storage by forests is either over-reported or over-exaggerated. And so it's necessary to have a third-party auditing type function or verification type function where we have a look at what projects are being implemented, what metrics are being collected, and then we provide a rating for that project. And so we've partnered with Dalberg and with Financial Services Deepening Africa, which is a UK FCO-sponsored NGO, to develop this Biodiversity Investment Ratings Agency for Africa. And what we will do is we'll examine the various biodiversity conservation projects and the metrics that they are measuring, and we'll provide an A to F rating. If it's an A rating, you're doing really well. You're reporting on exactly what you say you are. You've really thought about your metrics. You're delivering value to investors. If it's an F rating, then you're at the bottom of the scale and you'd need to improve what you're doing. So providing that third-party authenticity is a really valuable and essential part of the ecosystem that we need to set up to enable investment to come into biodiversity projects and biodiversity conservation. And we're well placed to do it. As a university, as a School of Wildlife Conservation, we can easily act as an independent third party in this process. So we're developing the frameworks at the moment. It's not an easy problem to solve a lot of the time. But the Biodiversity Investment Ratings Agency will have a home at the African Leadership University School of Wildlife Conservation, and we hope to be providing that service as soon as possible. Apologies for interrupting the interview, but this podcast is brought to you by Flipper, the #1 marketplace to buy and sell online businesses and startups. So my quick question to you is, do you own or run your own online business? And have you ever considered selling your site, your store, your tech, or your app? Well, with world-class combined matching technology, dedicated brokers and end-to-end services, all at the most efficient price, Flipper makes selling your online business simple. So to get a free valuation, simply visit flipper.com/techtalks, where each month thousands of online business owners exit with Flipper. Again, to learn more, visit flipper.com/techtalks. But now back to the interview. And as you said, it is a very complex issue and also very sensitive for a lot of business leaders, I would imagine. So I'm curious, where do you begin to approach the issue of creating something like a compulsory compliance and risk reporting framework that actually makes it mandatory for multinational companies to report on their biodiversity impact and exposure to risk from biodiversity loss? Where do you begin there?
It's a difficult problem to solve, and we certainly are not going to be doing that on our own. And so there are various groupings, Business for Nature being one of them, who are a grouping of over 1,000 companies in 70 different countries, representing a total revenue of $5 trillion. And they've come together to call on governments to adopt these policies now and reverse this nature loss during this decade. And so they were well represented at the current Biodiversity Conference in Canada, COP15. And with the hashtag Make It Mandatory, they are advocating for these kinds of policies where risk reporting and exposure to biodiversity becomes compulsory, and where your impact on biodiversity becomes compulsory too. And for us, this is the key to unlocking the value. If companies, multinationals, are required to report on something, that means they need to implement the procedures within those companies in order to report and comply with that regulation. That means that our metrics become a product that they want to buy. So the metrics and the technology that we've spoken about earlier, that we roll out in an ecosystem restoration project, fulfill the need for risk reporting and compliance. And when you have a supply and a demand, like in any market, you can put a price on that, and we can start selling these metrics as a service to the risk and compliance reporting that becomes mandatory. But ultimately, it's governments that need to implement this. Ultimately, it's pressure, from business, but business can't voluntarily take it on. Or they could, but not in a meaningful way. This needs to be mandatory, and it needs to be something that becomes a routine part of reporting. And so, with many of these things, governments introduce policy. They give companies a few years to adjust to that policy and to put the metrics or the management structures in place. And then after some time, those policies become enabled in legislation. And then you're in, and then you're locked in. You've got to, the law says you've got to report, 100%.
And of course, you mentioned COP15 there, and we're recording this podcast right in the middle of COP15. For anyone listening, hearing about that for the first time, could you just tell the listeners a little bit more about what that is and why that is quite exciting this week too?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of confusion because you just come out of COP27. Where COP27, of course, is the UNFCCC. It's the climate change division of the United Nations that meets to discuss big policy on climate change. COP15 is the United Nations Biodiversity Division, so specifically focuses on biodiversity. And COP, of course, stands for the Conference of Parties. So it's just the conference of the parties to this UN convention. And it's a different convention to the Climate Change Convention. But many of the same countries and the same parties are signatories to both of these things. But they meet separately because the biodiversity issue is a much more focused issue. And so that's the meeting happening this week.
And of course, we're getting towards the end of 2022. There's a lot of businesses and governments and the conversations around if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, and taking action is getting more and more important. So rather than concentrating on the problem right now, I'm curious what your big focus will be in 2023, and also what makes you hopeful about the future.
So the big focus for 2023 is as we develop the frameworks and as they become more mature around the Biodiversity Investment Ratings Agency, we will start implementing a pilot project in Rwanda. We have 2, possibly 3 areas that we will start biodiversity restoration, of course, always focusing on people and livelihoods as well, and trying to bring those together in a sustainable development project that serves as a pilot for testing some of our ratings through this ratings agency. It'll be a pilot for the financing as well. We'll need investment partners. It'll be a pilot for them as much as it will be for us in terms of how we structure the investments, how we do the reporting, what metrics they require and what metrics we implement. So 2023, big focus on our pilot projects in Rwanda. Hopeful about the future. The fact that people are talking about this stuff, and they're talking about it at the highest level is gives me hope. We're not going to solve these problems quickly or easily, but this is the first time that biodiversity is firmly on people's lists of problems that need to be addressed when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the impact of humanity on the earth in general. So I'm hugely hopeful that we're going to move towards a solution.
And you've spent a lot of your time today to share this conversation with people all around the world. I'm going to see if there's something that I can do to help you. Now, some of the biggest names in business, VC funding and tech have either been guests or even listened to this podcast. So is there a person you'd love to have a private breakfast or lunch with, and why? Because he or she might just be listening to this, and I'd love to send it out into the universe and see what we can manifest together today. But who would you choose and why?
Well, I was going to answer your question and say that I would like to have lunch with Larry Fink, head of BlackRock. But actually, he's already saying what I'm saying. So he's off the list. And then I thought, well, maybe I could have lunch with Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England. But he's also saying what I'm saying. So I'm running out of lists of people who are not saying this stuff. And I guess, a big name, of course, always when it comes to this kind of thing is Elon Musk.
Yeah.
The guy's, pretty dynamic. He's also got a good filter on him. And so I'm hoping that if I did have lunch with him, he'd tell me why this is just hopeless and why this is never going to work, and disagree with all the other big names that come on. Or perhaps he'll say, this is a really good idea. We need to develop biodiversity as a new asset class and shift some investment into getting this thing up and running.
What a great answer. What I love about how you chose it there is I think we're living in a world where everyone's living inside their own echo chambers and almost having their own views fed back to them. And you chose someone that would possibly have a different view to you, because that's where the learning's done, isn't it? Sitting down with people who may not see the world as you do and learn from each other. Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm always very aware of the fact that in a complex situation like this, I might not have all the best ideas. And the only way to test that is to put those ideas out there and have someone criticize them. So I welcome criticism, and I welcome, picking apart these things, because it's the only way to solve a complex problem. You're not going to solve it on our own.
100%. And for anyone listening that would like to get involved, maybe they want to find out more information or even contact your team, or maybe have a question that they want to ask, what's the best starting point?
Well, you can have a look at our website. If you Google the School of Wildlife Conservation at the African Leadership University, it's normally one of the first hits that you get on a Google search. Or you can contact me directly, Mike Musgrave, on my email address, which we'll put at the end of this podcast.
Awesome. And I'll add a link to your LinkedIn profile as well for anyone that wants to contact you. I always say at the end of every episode that technology works best when it brings people together. And what I love about what you're doing here is you're bringing people together and bringing the world together to solve complex issues that ultimately impact the place where we all live, this tiny rock floating through space. And anything that can improve biodiversity and solve real world problems with technology at the heart of that is a big win for me. So a big thank you for taking the time to come on here and share your story with me today.
Thanks, Neil. It's been great chatting to you.
So my big takeaway from today's conversation is, of course, less talk and more action. That's what's required to make an impact on biodiversity. And maybe developing a Biodiversity Investment Ratings Agency can provide that third-party verification service for project developers and businesses to ensure that we're all achieving a real impact together. And ultimately, we must aim to build the asset value of biodiversity too, not just a revenue stream, so that we can then attract institutional finance in the amounts needed to finance the management of landscapes. So it is a huge problem that is going to require us all coming together. But there is an opportunity to make a real impact here. And I'm going to be following the pilot project in Rwanda that Mike talked about there, and how testing the metrics, management, financing and product delivery that changes biodiversity from that free input into an economy asset class that reflects its real value to economic activity. There's something quite magical happening there. It is very complex. It will take time. And I'd love to get Mike back on next year to see what measurable impact they're making. And hopefully everybody else can start following suit there. Because as the old saying says, you can only improve what you can measure. And that's why Mike's work is so valuable. But you've heard from me and you've heard from Mike today. And we have people listening all over the world. And I'm confident that every single person listening is going to have a viewpoint on here. And as Mike said, it's not about just getting people together that agree with you. It's about hearing different viewpoints, discussing and debating the pros and cons of different actions, etc., and the best way forward. Because planet Earth is our mutual home, and biodiversity plays a crucial role in protecting our home. So with that in mind, simply send me an email, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC.Hughes, and my website is techblogwriter.co.uk, where you'll find over 2,200 interviews. Today was biodiversity and the difference that technology can make. Tomorrow will be a completely different topic, and I cordially invite you to join me again then too. But a big thank you for listening today, and until next time, don't be a stranger.